Wow. What? This is exciting, guys. We're what, week 5, day 5. You're just about halfway through boot camp. Made it this far, and we're gonna celebrate with a nice midterm project. I think the midterms are actually like a super exciting time. You guys get to be creative. You get to do your first true group work together. And today we're just going to be looking mostly at planning your midterm. The like subheader is like, you're not ready to code yet. And that's just because with this project, we're going to have to do a lot more planning than we've done in the past. And with good planning, we'll have good results in the end. So that's what we're focused on. Are you guys excited? How are you feeling about the midterm? Is it like a cool thing? Are you apprehensive, or what's the range of emotions going through you? Woo! yeah, get hyped. It's gonna be cool. And it's exciting because you guys you've done a lot in the first 5 weeks, and you're ready for a project like this. To some degree, you have all the tools to be like a web developer. You've seen the back end, you've seen the front end. This week, you've looked at database design and SQL queries. So you have the full powers to build a web application. The rest of the weeks going forward, we're just going to be like kind of layering on top of what you know, introducing you to more powerful tools, some more modern solutions for some of the things you've been doing. But like at this point, you really have a nice suite of tools, and so it makes a great moment to do a project on your own. You guys have probably looked through the different options that you have here. We've got 7 kind of projects that are options. You've also gotten your partners at this point. How many people are like sure on what they're going to work on? Kind of, not. I don't see any like. Is anyone like, I know 100% which project I'm going to take? That's good. So I don't want you to be like 100%. I'm a resource wall man through and through. No one's taking me off that train. We're gonna be looking through the planning process, but I encourage you to pick 2 to 3 of these projects and talk about it thoroughly with your partner. Go through some of the initial planning that we're gonna go through. Really like hound out what you're gonna have to do for that project, what you like about it, what you don't like about it, and from there you can hone in from those 2 to 3 choices and pick one and really do the full planning process. But it's good at this point to not be too pigeonholed into one project. Yeah, so think of a couple. I'm sure there's a few that interest you, and explore them thoroughly. Maybe do a few of the steps that we're going to look at today with those projects, but don't settle on one too quickly yet. So this is probably a bigger project than anything you've done up to this point. It might be a bit daunting. I'm like, where do you start? That's what we're here for today, to kind of look through. But conceptually, all of these projects, and to a large extent web development in general, the starting point is data. Web applications revolve around data, and we can actually think of most web applications as just a way to repackage and distribute information or distribute data. We think of like we think of like Reddit. Reddit is just a way to take all of these collective stories and posts that people have made and display it to us users in a friendly way so that we can read it, we can share it, and we can contribute to it in different ways. We think of any social network, maybe, I mean, we don't use Facebook that much anymore, but Facebook itself, its product is its data. It's its collection of users, their posts, everything they do on a site. If like tomorrow there was like a big server crash and Facebook lost all of their like application side code, so like they didn't have a front end anymore, they didn't have a back end anymore, but they still retained all of their data, they would still have a product. They'd be down for some period of time, but they'd probably send their developers full time into that, and within some reasonable period of time, they'd have the whole app up and going again. But conversely, if the same thing happened and like all of their user data was just wiped out, they would have a very tough time coming back and still being a relevant application. If there's no user data on there, all of our stories, all of our histories and interactions are on there, their product just isn't a product anymore. So with a lot of these projects too, they're going to be revolving around what is the data that we're using and how are we showing it to the user. So like, what is the data you can access or acquire? Can you correlate that data to something else? How can you pivot that data to add value? So thinking of like a non-existent application, maybe I want to make a web application for like botanists, so they can do like field study journals on the plants that they see and record them for later. What's the data that I can access or acquire? Maybe there's an API out there that already has a huge listing of all the plants local to my area. It has like their name, their Latin name, a description, maybe pictures. I can draw that into my application. Can I correlate that data to something else? Maybe there's some information from that API about where these plants are found. I can do a correlation and show on the map, maybe like a heat map of like, oh, this type of plant seems to be more prevalent in like this area. How can you pivot that data to add value? My taking of just data points of where plants are located and showing them in a better user interface of like a heat map, that's like a pivot or adding value to data that already exists. You're going to be thinking a lot about features and benefits and kind of like battling between the two of them with your application. All benefits are probably features, but not all features are going to be benefits. And what I mean from this, the benefits are the things that people come to your application for. When someone describes me a new, like, oh, there's this new thing, I can do this, this, and this. They're describing like, oh, like, for instance, like Grammarly is really cool because I can edit all of my content without opening another page, or like it helps me do spelling checks. It does this. No one's coming to me about like Grammarly and saying like, hey, you got to check out Grammarly's sweet sign-up form. It's got an incredible login, and that two-factor authentication that it does, damn, like Grammarly's so good at logging me in. So that would be one difference between a feature and a benefit. A feature of your application, you might have login. You might have like some nice validation for data input. And you might need those things, but we really want to focus on the benefits of your app. The thing that like pulls people to use it. The reason you're excited probably about the project, and the reason other people would want to use the application in general. And sometimes the difference between a feature and benefit is whether that thing, that feature, fits a universal value. I don't like fully agree with these universal values. We have like a universal value. It makes someone look good, feel good, save time, or save money. So what's that? Like Honey. Honey's like a Chrome extension that like finds you like coupon codes or whatever. Like their universal value might be that you're saving money, and probably also you're saving time in like hunting down all of those coupon codes. We're not restricted to these four. If you feel that like you want another value to be aligned with like the main use of your application, just try and make those connections. What are the like human values that your features are speaking to? this like features versus benefit thing. It's going to be, we'll see it later, but it's very tied to the idea of a minimum, like an MVP, a minimum viable product. Our product needs to be demoable, and we want to show off the benefits of our project. We don't necessarily have to complete all of the features to make it like a product ready to be used by everyone. Meaning we can make it demoable on like a happy path on how a normal user might use it. We don't have to think, oh, what happens if like we have a really weird user and they try to go to my users / like some random words here. Oh no, my application's breaking. I'm gonna have to build in another feature so that I don't have my app breaking under these like weird circumstances. We don't have to go down those holes. We just think of during the normal use case, does it perform? And can we show those things to the people you're gonna be demoing, your friends, and anyone who might be using this midterm project. The way we're going to be outlining these benefits, and to some degree some features, is through user stories. So user stories is the idea of taking the flow or the actions that a user might do to your application and like just quantifying them or writing them down on paper, usually in a specific way. So one example of a user story follows this pattern. As a blank, I want to blank because of this. So I could say, as a botanist, I want to record my field journals on an application because it will save time opposed to doing it by hand in paper. We can also have another pattern. As a blank, I should be able to blank because this. So again, like as a botanist, I should be able to know where to find a certain plant because I want to do research on that plant. These are maybe more general ones, but our user stories will get more specific to the actual flow of our application as well. So a user scenario might be very application specific. Given something, when this happens, then I want this to happen. So given a plant I'm looking for, when I type that into the search bar of my application, then I should see all of the locations where I can find that plant. For us, a lot of these user scenarios are going to come directly from like the requirements that we've seen around the different projects we've looked at. So those 7 projects on Compass, if you look at like the like card game, it has a bunch of points underneath that like the card game should be able to do this thing. It should be able to do this thing. It should be able to do this thing. It's your job to look at both or like each of those requirements and see, is that a single user story or should I break that down into multiple things? Let's look at maybe even just an example. So we've got the food pickup ordering. The restaurant and client both need to be notified since this app serves an intermediary. So we can look at this bullet point and think, what user stories come from this requirement? Can anyone think of like a specific user story that you might define based on this requirement that we see under the food pickup ordering? There's no like right answer. It's up to interpretation too how we see this.
There's a customer or like a user
Uh-huh.
who selects a single restaurant.
Yeah.
And then they basically can choose something from the menu.
Uh-huh.
And then again, that's like one thing. And then another thing is that they can place the order. And that sends the SMS to the restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's another thing. And then another thing is that probably the restaurant can fulfill the order and mark it as completed.
Mm-hmm.
And
So like,
return the text.
yeah, those are like a bunch of user stories. Those are good ones. Exactly. So we can just start with a rough breakdown like that, and from that we can go into maybe a little more depth depending on what the story is. So an example here, this is kind of more of a framework for how we could do a user story. We have a title, we have like maybe a traditional user story statement, we've got a scenario, and then at the bottom we have some additional information. So for this application, as a user, I want to be able to save a story I'm reading because I found it useful. Often this traditional user story is like motivation based. It's like, this should explain the why of this story or the why of this feature. The scenario is a little more particular to the application itself. We have that given that I'm reading a story, when I tap the icon to save a story, then save it to my saved stories. So this is using language that is a little bit closer to what our actual application is. We have like the concept of what is a saved story. We have icon. We were using words like tap and save, which are more pertinent to an actual application. Whereas this one's just like a gut, like I want to do this, and this is why. And then finally, we might break down the user story into some things that are actually relevant to our design. So for our app, we want icons to be bookmark icons. And any other information on design or something. Oh, there's a pointer. Another example is like, as a user, I want to save a story I'm reading because I found it useful, and then we use this larger given statement. Given that I'm reading a story, when I tap the icon to save a story, I then save it to my saved stories, and then they're using a keyword and alter the icon to indicate success. Here, we're getting a bit lower, closer to the application. If you want to use like and statements within your user story, they're to highlight what happens to your user interface or your user interaction and design. So given a user story and whatever the UI response should be. I do this. I want to alter an icon to indicate success. Any questions on like user stories? This here seems like kind of formulaic. Your user stories don't have to be as like, same structure as this. As long as you can go through all of your user stories and feel like you've hit all of the points of your application. You shouldn't just do user stories for like the big things or like the things that you're interested in. Try and follow the flow of like every one of your user stories and think, does this encompass all the actions that I want someone to be able to do in this application that I've made? Because these user stories are going to be the base point for designing everything else from your application. And this is something that you can do kind of right off the bat with those 3 ideas or the three projects you might be interested in. Start writing down just like free form a list of user stories for each one of them and think, okay, what are the things that this user story will require? Is this a user story that I'm interested in implementing? But yeah, at this point, you really want to be thorough in hitting all of the things that your application should have. After designing all of these user stories, the idea that you can go through each user story, and after you've gone through all 10, 15, 20 of your user stories, the feeling that like this encompasses everything that a user should be able to do, then your user stories would be at a stage that you would call feature complete. Your application has all of the features that it needs to like at base accomplish that main like driving goal that brings people to your application. We looked at MVP. It accomplishes this like minimum viable product, and most of all, it accomplishes the like aha moment of your application. This aha moment is like the reason why I would use the food pickup ordering thing. the reason why I would use like Shoodle, the reason why I would use the resource wall, and so on and so forth. So think of like what is the main drawing feature for each of these, and am I hitting that main drawing feature with my user stories? Anyone know what this is or what this building's called? It's a house. Yeah. So it's a house. Did you say retirement home? This would be a pretty horrible retirement home, probably. Anyone else know what it is?
Picture.
It's a picture. Yeah, we dude, man. Well, it's a famous house. So this is called the I'm pretty sure it's the Winchester house. And the story behind this home is that there was this older lady living here, and she was really into getting advice from like mediums and psychics, and they told her that like the house was haunted. She's like, oh no, my house is haunted. Like, how am I gonna get rid of all these ghosts? And instead of like, I don't know, doing like an exorcism or getting them out of there, these like mediums told her that like, oh, you gotta make your house like super confusing so that the ghosts just get lost and they like don't bother you anymore. So she started just adding onto her home like just components and like things at random. She's like, oh, I'm gonna put a spiral staircase here. Where's it gonna go? I don't know, I'll figure that out later. I'm gonna put like a window that goes out this way, and then like, oh, it faces a wall. That's fine. So let's look. I think there's like cool photos. I don't know actually. The top? Yeah, San Jose. This is all the outside. I want to see some like, yeah, I don't know what that is. There's some like stairs that just go into a wall or a roof. There's a lot of stuff like this. So yeah, not a great retirement home probably, but the thing that this is like supposed to highlight, I guess, is with a project or a more open-ended project, you can have something that's known as like feature creep, and that's the idea that like as we're building the project, we can always come up with new ideas. Like we're a couple weeks into development, and we're like, oh, it'd be really cool is if we added this new feature to my predictive to-do list that knows when I'm hungry, and I'm going to record over the day how hungry I am, and then it will be able to like know into the future. Oh, and the next day you're like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if my predictive to-do list knew what choices I've made in the past, and then it like decides that I should go see a movie. And you could keep coming up with these ideas. The problem is if you start adding too many ideas later into your development, you're going to end up with an application that is like akin to this house. It's very patchworky. You keep adding on stuff. Things don't finish correctly, and you don't get like a coherent product in the end. So you have today and this weekend to really get a nice plan on what you do and what you don't want to do in your project. But after that point, after you kind of reach an end to your planning, try and stop yourself from like uttering the sentence like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if, or what if we added this, because it can get you down like a really dangerous, not a dangerous, but like a route that you'll end up with something that's probably going to be incomplete in the time period we have. So I encourage you to be creative. The requirements that you see within Compass, those are like a guideline. If you want to like flex those a little bit in different directions, if you want to add your own personal flair in there, by all means go ahead and do that. But after, say, like Saturday or Sunday, try not to go back to the drawing board too much in adding anything new, because your project will just grow and grow to the point where either you can't finish it, or if you do finish it, the different pieces that you've added weren't like planned thoroughly through, so they don't really make sense in context to the bigger picture of your product.
What's the most impressive
For midterms? I don't know. The thing like midterms, most people stay fairly close to the project requirements. So in terms of like impressiveness, it's like when people do creative things or they do like nice UI. To be honest, you guys saw, or no, did you? Yeah, did you see their group when they were finishing? Some of their midterms were some of the best I've ever seen. So
Did you guys hear that?
Two of you do that.
Thanks, Travis.
I mean, they were okay. Get out of here. So those ones were really nice, and they did add some like spins on it and stuff. So get creative, but it's also like through and through a chance for you to learn and develop on your skills. I know you've probably found that the pace of Lighthouse, and this is by design so far, has been like so fast, and you barely get a chance to like stand on stable ground before like the rug's ripped up behind underneath your feet and you're on to something new. So I find with the midterms, it's often a nice chance to like consolidate your learning, like to go back and revisit all of the different things that you've seen in these 5 weeks and start to get a better like firmer grasp, or at least like a more solid feeding on these types of things. So it's yeah, also like, hey, what can I produce, and let's try and make something really good. But at the same time, it's a learning experience, and it's not about like whether it's the best project in the end. You do have what, like just under a week to do it, which is a nice amount of time. So I believe you guys can do great things, but don't put too much pressure on yourself that it has to be amazing or anything. We want it to be feature complete. And what I said earlier about like no one's gonna care about how elaborate your login things. If you're not gonna demo it, like don't build it. You're not making a finished product. We're making like a demo, and you're making a midterm project to like proof of concept and to show that the idea is really cool. You don't need like an FAQ or like an about page. You probably don't need a sign up page. And my big push, or more than likely, like you shouldn't have like 2 detailed login pages. For a lot of the applications, you're thinking, but Travis, like this thing needs users. How can I have users without like a login page? Just fake it. So you can hard code a bunch of users, and then maybe in the back end you just throw up a simple route like this that just takes in a user ID and then like logs them in with no verification and just lets you impersonate that user. Of course, you would never do this in production. If you go to your jobs after Lighthouse and they're like, hey, build us a nice authentication route for our new users, and you throw down this code, and they come back to you and they're like, what is this? And you're like, I don't know, Travis told me at Lighthouse this is how you do a login. Don't. I told you not to do it, so don't do this. But for your midterms, this is probably more than enough. If you were to take the project, beyond that stage, yes, you'd probably want to make like real authentication. Yes, you'd probably want to have a sign-up page and all of these extra features. But for your project, unless your project was about verification, about authentication, you probably wouldn't want to put too much effort into any of these things here. Of course, if your aha like moment of your project is that it's a really cool way of authenticating users that others can use, you're going to have to like go into that. It's not that like login pages and sign up pages in themselves are like intrinsically not useful or like interesting, but if that's not the purpose of your application, you don't want to spend too much time on it. ERDs or ERDs. This is something you guys have been familiarizing yourself with over this week, so it's nice and fresh in your mind. This is the next stage in our development. And where are we going to get the design for our entity relationship diagrams? What information could we draw from to build these things at this point in our planning process? Sorry? Yeah, previous diagrams might be a good place to draw inspiration. What's the other thing that we've made at this point in our planning process? User stories. So we're going to want to use our user stories to build up our entity relationship diagrams. And what we can do is we can look back to the user stories and we can look for the nouns that we see throughout our user stories. So for example, here we have, as a user, I want to be able to save a story I'm reading because I found it useful. The two nouns in that initial user story, I need to bring back my, is user and story. So for both of these nouns, maybe we want a table within our database. We might need a user table and we might need a story table. So our first step might be to just come back here, create a users table, create a stories table, and then going throughout our user stories, we might be able to pick up relationships, we might be able to pick up what stuff a user has within it, and so on and so forth. So like a user saving a story, maybe that means a story belongs to a user. If we have two nouns appearing in the same user story, there might be a link between them. We can think about things like that. Yeah, so one of our user stories here, this is not the stories thing, but we have users and posts. A user story that might have driven this was that a user can make many posts about a topic. I don't know what this thing is, but you would draw the tables from the nouns, and once you've gone through all of your user stories and you've kind of highlighted all of the nouns that you found and produce them as tables, then you can go through and kind of think of, okay, what is the data I need for each of these nouns? What should a story have stored? What should a user have stored? And so on and so forth. We're going through these steps kind of in an incremental order, like we're building user stories, and then we're building ERDs. And next, we're going to look at some other things that we need to build. But one thing about this whole process is that it is somewhat circular, or it's you can always loop back to the previous step as you go forward. If you get to the point where you're planning your ERDs and you realize that oh, I totally forgot about this other thing that I wanted to include within, or that we need to include within the project, you might have to go back to your user stories and add a new user story. It's not like a one-way street. You're kind of iteratively going through each step. So tech choices for this midterm project, we've seen already that it's going to be similar more to a real job workflow, in that you still get to decide the exact project and kind of the exact requirements that project needs to have. But we've given you the team that you're going to be working for the project. We've given you somewhat of a structure. And in terms of tech, we've also outlined some broad things of what you have to use within tech. So you will have tech choices, but for instance, in the back end, you're going to be using Node and Express. In the front end, you'll probably just be using a blend of HTML, CSS, and jQuery. You can explore around and see what libraries you might want to use. You can explore around and see what Node modules you might want to use in the back end. Don't think that you're limited in what you can use tech-wise. Anything that you've seen from week 1 all the way to now can be a resource that you pull on for this project. If you want to do some research into other modules or other front-end libraries or things that you might be able to pull in, you go for it and see if it fits within the scope of your project. You might want to call over a mentor and see what their opinion on using that tech is. But get creative and into which tech you use. The other tech decision that you might want to think about is how you're going to deploy your application. So you kind of got two options for this. Good old trusty localhost, and maybe you want to try deploying it to Heroku. from a midterm standpoint, this is probably like the good option to go with, and you don't have to feel like, oh, I'm only deploying on localhost. That's not as good. It's more about the application that you're making. This shouldn't be such a big decision. The case where I would encourage you to think about deploying to Heroku is if deployment to Heroku is something you're interested in. If this whole idea, doesn't spark any sort of interest in you, just use the localhost. If you do decide to go down the route of deploying to Heroku, in the next few days, do a bit of research into what that involves for your project. Look up like Node Express application deployment to Heroku. You can go through probably a quick tutorial or something and see what the steps are to doing a deployment to Heroku. Because this is the thing where it will be somewhat beneficial for you to set up the pipeline for deploying to Heroku early on in your project. If you build a project from the start around the idea that like it's easy to deploy to Heroku, then at the end and as you're continuing, you can do deploys and you can test, and then at the end you'll have an application that you can deploy to Heroku. If you don't even think about deploying to Heroku, you build the whole application, and at the end you decide to like configure it to be deployable to Heroku, it's not going to be a huge challenge, but it'll be a bit harder than doing it from the beginning. Again, this is not a huge like stress point or thing you should be worried about too much. But if you are interested in learning more about deployment, maybe consider doing some research and thinking about that early on in your project. Otherwise, localhost is just as good. And you can do things with localhost, like you can allow others to access your application over localhost if you give them your IP. So if you're worried about like, oh, I want to demo my app and I want one person to be able to use it here and another person on another computer to be able to use it, you can do those things with localhost. So it's not going to be overly restrictive in terms of technically what you can do on one versus the other. Let's take actually before we break, any questions on some of the planning stages we've looked at up to this point? Or just on the project in general? Is everyone like,
If we have an idea for something that's not on the list of projects, are we allowed to do it if it's within scope?
yes, but you still have to like pitch it. So if you got a really cool idea that you think would be doable within that time frame and is thematically somewhat similar to the other things, it's not like making a remote car with a Raspberry Pi, then come talk to like myself or Nima, and we can kind of, well, actually Nima's not here right now, and he'll be back Monday, but that's probably too late. So if you do have an idea, come talk to me, and I can kind of think about it and talk to the education team and see if it's something that is viable. But yeah, you're not hard restricted to those things. I think they're good to use because they're like tried and tested, and you can express your creativity within those requirements. But yeah, if you have something that's totally different, come talk to us. But also make sure, because this is a team project, and part of it is like development, but part of it is also learning how we work together with our teammates. So just make sure, whether you're doing your own idea or whether you're picking from the list or whether you have a really cool idea to like kind of be creative within the requirements, that everyone on your team's on board, and it's a collective experience in deciding what you want to do and like how you want to do it, and so forth. Yeah. Any other questions? Cool. We'll do a 15-minute break. We'll come back at 5 to 11, and we'll keep plugging along. What would be your guys' biggest tips to someone starting their midterm project?
Stay focused. prioritize the
Everything else.
somewhere. Yeah, that's a good one. Don't try to build everything with you.
You guys did that, yeah?
Yeah, everything took a while. That's why.
Yeah.
Yeah, and some of it's like.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe I don't. You need to have a plan. Thanks, dude. Like you're committing and merging plan. Everybody's got to be on board with that. What? I think for like two people, it was a little bit. It was okay. We were able to figure it out like as we went, but I'm not sure like you might. Oh yeah. You might want to have really good structure. What we did was either of us should just go to master and merge.
Yeah.
But maybe it's a better idea to have one person in charge of like for a while.
Merges.
Do the pull request, like doing it that way.
Yeah.
But our problem was when we were at that stage, we never did it. We had never done like pull request.
Yeah.
And 5 minutes. This is the pull request process. This is how you deal with it.
Yeah. Yeah, those are good points.
Well, an Uno clone as a game. That'd be a little too difficult.
An Uno clone?
The project's really about building all this.
Mm,
That would be interesting, but hard to do.
yeah, think about it.
You got a week. Yeah, easy.
Go magic.
4 days. 4 days. So easy.
I guess Uno doesn't have. I'm trying to think of the rules for Uno.
Got the color match. It's a lot.
It would definitely be on the harder end of the what you could. So I think you could try and do it if you're like willing to like, okay, we're gonna have to put in more work than we normally would have. Yeah. Go ahead.
What's the minimum viable product to pass the midterm?
The minimals.
Yo, what? Look it up. What is it?
Where are we? I don't know. You shouldn't be the easiest one. I would say maybe.
My code?
You're fine. The decision maker's not too bad. I haven't seen anyone do the shoodle in like for like a long time. But I don't think it's too bad. Resource wall is not too bad. The hardest ones are the smart to-do list and the.
Isn't it just like
This, yeah, but you need to like pull from a bunch of APIs, so like, and then based on what they put in. So if you're going to like Gojira, it needs to search through each of those APIs to see if it has a match, and it finds a match in a restaurant. Then you would say like, oh, this is you auto tag it as a restaurant. It's not terribly hard. I think people the card game is the hardest. People, yeah. I think it's just like
There's no like APIs that are involved with it.
exactly, and you have to do a lot more of like your own logic in terms of like this happens and this happens, yeah. So I don't know, but I don't think
What
they're.
would you build?
I'd probably do the card game,
Arcade?
or I'd do my own thing.
You're working on these days.
I've got a game that's probably never gonna finish, and then I have some like contract work that isn't like terribly interesting.
Work full time here and then do
Yeah, it's sometimes too much.
So you're making bank then.
Nah, like some I don't know, not like Lighthouse is like an education company, so it's like awesome. It's an education company, so it's like awesome working here, but it's not like crazy lucrative or anything like that. Contracting,
But you make a lot of money on the contract.
you do make more money on contracts, and
How long did it take before you like
All right, we're gonna get started again in a second. Okay, so at this point in a kind of our planning journey, we have user stories. We built some ERD diagrams from the nouns of our user stories. Next, we're going to be thinking about the routes for our application. So the endpoints for our backend, the requests that we can make to our backend, and what the backend will do for us. We have to plan our routes. Do we want to use our different HTTP methods, get, post, put, patch, delete? Do our routes need params? Is there data that we have to be passing in the URL itself? Is there data that we have to be posting as a body? We want to use RESTful convention. So I think you guys have seen RESTful convention as a concept before. Is anyone like fresh off the top of their mind? Do we know what this means? Read. All right, so just as like maybe like a practical example. So our RESTful convention is a convention or a set of is a pattern for creating routes on our backend. We saw that we have those different HTTP methods. So we had like get, put, post, delete. RESTful convention is the idea of ordering our routes based on HTTP methods and resources associated with that method. So if I wanted to create a route, say we're back to my botany application, and I want to add, or I want to see all the journals for a particular user. What might my route be for that? And thinking about what we want to follow the format of, like if another application, if I wanted to get a particular song, not my botany application, like a song thing, this might be my route. So I'm getting the /song, and I'm giving it the song ID. If I wanted to get all the journals for this like hypothetical plant app, what route would I do? Yes. So what would I do to get all journals? Well, yeah, get songs. But if I was doing journals, it would be like journals. And then from here, if I wanted to create a new journal, I might have post to /journals. If I wanted to edit a particular journal, I might have a put to /journals /ID. Maybe I have some nested resources in my application, meaning for each journal, it's associated with a particular like comment. So I could have get journals / the idea of that journal / the comments. Or like similarly, I could have a particular comment. So in this stage of our planning, we need to come down and we need to think of all of the routes or endpoints that our backend should have using our HTTP methods and kind of following the convention of resource-based routes. Our resources are, again, going to be things that we saw in our ERDs, things that appeared in the noun or were nouns for our user stories. And then the purpose of each route is kind of going to come from the verbs of our user stories. So if here, back to the same user story, as a user, I want to save a story. So the verb is to save a story. I should have a route then. I should have a route where I can like post to slash stories. Like my route would be post slash stories, and I hate when you have to. And this would be to like save a story. It would be linked to my user stories. With our routes planning, I'm using the full set of HTTP methods, get, put, post, delete. For some of your early applications, we were kind of confined to just using post and get because just like vanilla HTML on the front end, we don't have access to the full array of HTTP methods. But later, when we're using things like jQuery and with AJAX requests, we were able to be more specific in which HTTP method that we were using. And using the full, like, well, not the full set of HTTP methods, because there are way more beyond this that are not as helpful, but at least using these primary ones, we're able to communicate a lot more about what the route does. If I have, for instance, I can do a delete to slash journals slash ID. And this is very distinct from my put to slash journal slash ID, even though they're the same path. Whereas if I was just confined to post, both of these routes would be post, and I would have to do something like this would be post, this would be post, and then I'd have to add an extra like delete here or something. So we're planning RESTful routes using that convention. And we're drawing the resource of that route from our nouns and the action for that route from the verbs that we see within our application. So it might be a lot of standard stuff like create, read, update, and destroy, or delete. But we might have some more interesting verbs that we find within our user story. We're not always just create, reading, update, and deleting stuff. We also might be like if we're doing the card game, maybe we have an endpoint that does a shuffle. Or if we we want to get a new random card, there might be other things we need from our backend. To me, both the wireframe and these routes that we're planning can kind of be done together. But wireframe is taking our user stories and turning them into like a visual representation of how our app actually will look as we're going through each of these user stories. Usually your wireframe will kind of represent data hierarchies as well. So if a user has many stories, the user page will have like a list of stories. Just in the layout of the page itself, you'll see hierarchies forming. Like within a post, there might be a list of comments. Within a comment, there might be like likes and dislikes. There's different tiers to the layout you see. These wireframes don't have to be like overly complex. We're not doing like full colored mock-ups with all of like the nice Photoshop icons and everything. They're just to visually show how we're interacting with our application, and they should be clear enough to know what the UI is for particular actions, like how do I go from one page to the next, things like that. So this is not a great quality picture, but this is like a good example of like a wireframe with enough detail in the planning stage. And you can make these with just like paper. You can do like whiteboard and take pictures of them. There's also a lot of tools online that you can use if you want to use it that way, but you don't have to put Like early on when you're prototyping, maybe you want to do a lot of these fast and do revisions on them. You don't need to put like tons of time into each one. You can make them fast and improve upon them fast as well. We don't want wireframes like this. This is like very unclear in terms of a lot of things. Like what image is going here? What does this text even represent? Notifications? Like what? Is this like a notifications bar that like scrolls in new notifications? Should this be like a list? It's very hard to tell what this wireframe is actually supposed to represent. We can also go to the other extreme and say like, some nice passive-aggressive comments on the right here. What the frick? We also don't want to like get crazy and like try and fill up every piece of space within our UI, because that doesn't make it better. So this is like way too much stuff, even though it might be clear in what each thing is doing. Once we have a few nice wireframe pages, we want to start linking them together, and this is the process of like storyboarding. So if I have 10 wireframes, maybe I align them in the order that they're going to happen. So like we transition from this wireframe into this wireframe, or maybe we give our wireframes a whole set of numbers, and I can write out a set of storyboards that go like from wireframe 1, if the user clicks this thing, it will bring them to wireframe 2 or wireframe 7, and we can get a story in a chronological format. You could lay them out in a comic or movie style thing. Once you have like this storyboard thing, this is where you should really see that as interacting with your application, you're accomplishing those main like aha moments. This is also where you're building like a narrative. You're thinking of like an average user like Bob is going through my application, my card game. How are they using it? What's their motivation for going through these different wireframes? You can also draw back on this storyboard later when you're like eventually demoing this project, like in a week's time, when you're standing up where I am and you're saying like, we built the card game because of this, this, and that. A great way to demo is to follow a narrative, like a human-driven story as to why a person is using your project and what they're going through. So like you have a hypothetical user, like our user Tom, he is really into card games. He wants to play with other friends, but they don't live close to each other. So he downloads, or he goes to our webpage, supercardgames.com, and he's brought up with Goofspiel, and like go through the wireframes, but like with your now completed application with this like user-driven story. It's a really nice way to show off your project in the end. It's just saying that like when you do a wireframe and as a storyboard, it's like a comic, and it's the same thing for the wireframes that we're creating. So at this point, from our user stories, we've pulled out the nouns for our database tables, we pulled out the verbs for our routes, and now we're building probably a lot of these storyboards from a particular like user story. So we should be able to go through each of the user stories that we've created and check off each of them as that, seeing that they're represented in a particular storyboard. So did my storyboard cover that a user creates a story and then the icon alters and indicates success? Was that represented in my storyboard? If so, I'll check it off and then just go down the list and make sure I'm hitting all of the points. Next, and this is part of wireframes and user stories itself, is design. So we get a bit of a design layout here when we're making these wireframes, but we need to go from this into something that actually is like fully fleshed out. And part of the thing is that at this point, we are not designers. We're in a web development bootcamp. Sometimes some of us might have had backgrounds in what we've done design before, and it's a skill that we have. But often a lot of us are kind of like, I'm not super into design. I don't know how to make something look really good. And if we're coming from that feeling, we don't have to dive deeply into design and do this all by hand. We can just kind of come in and just like steal the work that everyone else has done. So there's like frameworks that we can just use, and we can say like, oh, there's this cool framework, they've got cool buttons, I'm gonna use that. Or I'm making a, like one of them is Shoodle. It's like a doodle-based application. You can be like, oh, let's look at what the Doodle does when they're making their events and things, and let's use some UI that's like very similar to that. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. This slide just like every website template or like product page you go to is like the big hero banner with the image, then like the 3 columns telling you why to buy the stuff, the menu that follows you. Have you guys seen that documentary, Everything is a Remix? It's really cool. If you guys want to check it out sometime. I think the whole thing's available on YouTube. But essentially the idea that as a creative, most things are just like remixed or remastered from other things that worked well in the past. It's very often that design or anything creative comes from a standpoint of like pure originality. And we can really make use of that as web developers and say, let's remix and let's use things that worked and just incorporate them into our applications. So look around at some websites that you've seen, some applications that might do stuff similar to yours. You know, absorb the things that you like, discard the things that you don't. Here's a nice crane with some inspirational words. I don't know how helpful they are, but we'll take a moment of silence to read these. And the last thing is just like use a UI framework. It's going to take a lot of your time, and you're going to eat into a lot of your time if you're going to CSS and HTML everything by hand. I'm not saying don't do that, but just be cognizant of the time risk associated with taking that route. If you really want to get good at your CSS skills and you really want to like make front-end development a focus of your project, that could be something that you do, but the best choice of action, unless that's what you want to do, is to use a framework to steal from other designs and ideas and incorporate into your thing to make it look good. Grids, I guess, but more importantly, you're going to want to use a UI framework to help you to do things. Here's a few here. The big one that you're probably familiar with at this point is Bootstrap. And if you haven't seen Bootstrap, oh, where have you been? No, I'm just kidding. So Bootstrap's just a front-end library. Where you can say like, I really want to use a button, but the button in HTML looks really boring. Let's look at, wow, look at this button. It fades. It's got all these different colors I can use. I really want to use a form. Wow, cool forms. So, oh, they got validation already. Great. So use something like Bootstrap or Explorer. There might be other frameworks that you, or sorry, not frameworks, front-end libraries that you want to use to make this a bit easier on yourself. Oh, I gotta go through. Don't use this. I know this is like an older slide. This is not really a great front-end library that we're using anymore. Bootstrap's a nice one. But yeah, look, this is where, when we talked earlier about tech, you have some flexibility to explore and see what might be usable for you. Run it by someone maybe before you commit too heavily to a front-end library, but do some research for sure. One of the pro tips from the senior cohort here is that they wish they hadn't spent so much time on CSS and HTML, or at least the group who did it from scratch. So take that as a grain of salt and maybe don't follow in their ways. Yeah, any questions on wireframes to design, the process from there to there? No? Cool. Unfortunately, one of the things in like web development is that like design can often be like the bottleneck for people really taking to your project, because you could have like an amazing project that's like machine learning and like knows you, predicts everything you're going to do and provides a great schedule for you, or like another amazing project that like I don't know, that uses all this like intense tech and took years and years to code. But then if your front end is just like really bad and hard to use, people will just look at it and kind of like shrug it off and be like, yeah, I'm sure that thing sucks, even if it doesn't. So do put a bit of time into this. It's kind of unfortunate, but the more your front end is polished and looks nice, the more people will be appreciative of the tech that you did in the back end as well. But don't waste too much time making it all yourself. Git. This will be probably one of the biggest learning areas that you have during this project. You've been using Git for all of your 5 weeks, but this will be the first kind of like bigger group project where you're using Git. And Git is, using it in a group context is one of its most powerful features, but can also be one of its more confusing sides as well. So one of the final stages in planning is that we want to really think about the workflow that we're going to have between us and our partners for our project in regards to Git. You're going to want to sit down together. You're going to want to decide on which workflow you're going to use. Do a couple dry runs to see if it makes sense to each of you. One option is to have a single main Git project hosted by one of you on GitHub, so one of the project members, to have everyone else in the group clone that. And from there, you'll be following the pattern of every new thing that you want to make, you make a branch locally, you code, you test it. Once you're finished implementing that feature, you do a checkout from master, which is like merging, everything over, all your changes. And then you're going to pull from the remote to make sure that if your partner has pushed anything, you also have those changes. And then you're going to push to remote so that the remote version, the sole version that all of you guys share, has the new feature and it's working. And you're going to repeat this in cycle. Branching to work on a new feature. Once you're done, merging it and pushing it to the master. And then for every feature, you want to be working on a separate branch. So this is one pattern. This is probably the simplest pattern you can do. There's another pattern that has a lot of benefits where you would start with a single remote, and then you have everyone in your project fork that remote. So they have also remote versions of the project. You follow this same kind of steps 2 through 7. But at the end, you would do something called a pull request. And a pull request is a GitHub thing that says, there's the main project. I have a fork. And in my fork, I've added a new thing that I think should be added to the main project. So I submit a pull request, and the owner or the collaborators of the main project can then decide. They can look at the code that might be added, and you can decide to accept the pull request, which will merge it into the main project, or you can decide to suggest revisions for the pull request. You can say, this looks good, but I think it needs more linting. Or you can flat out just reject the pull request and say, this isn't ready to come into our master, or this shouldn't come into the master. If you want to go that second route, and it might be a good route if you have a bigger, are you guys all 2 people, or some of you have 3-person teams? Everyone's 3. So with a 3-person team, that might be something that might be worth looking at. We don't have the time in this lecture to kind of go through that whole process, or we might at the end if you guys are interested. It's something we can look at. But if you are interested, come ask me or another mentor, and we can go through it. The point, though, to stress is that you should really have this hammered down at the start. Really have a good idea of like what is the process of creating a new thing and pushing it to master, or pushing it to the remote and making sure that everyone else gets those changes. Yeah.
We shouldn't be working on the same page, right? As in same file.
Same file?
Yeah.
No, you can. So you shouldn't be working on the same functionality, I guess. Like if I'm trying to add feature A and you're also trying to add feature A, we run the risk of like both writing the same code or writing code that wants to do the same thing but is different, and that's where you're going to get into like merge conflicts. But yeah, exactly. Because Git has like smart merging. So quickly, if I have a file here and it just says hello at the top, and then this is the remote, and then I pull it down locally, and I say it should be hello world. Oh, I realize this isn't great for everyone to see. Just says hello world, and then someone else does a pull, and they get it, and they say, okay, I'm fine with it being hello, but on the same file, I want to add like good day. We have 3 versions right now, but Git knows the history of each of these versions. It knows that this happened first, then maybe I committed this new change, and in a similar timeline, this change was committed. I push this back up to master, or to my origin, and it adds this. When my friend pushes their changes back up, it doesn't just do a full like, oh, these are now the newest changes. It doesn't just slap this on top. It compares line for line. So it checks like line 1 against line 1, and it says which of these lines is newer. And it knows that like, oh, this was the old version, this is the new version, we'll keep this one. And then we look at the second line and we say, okay, there's nothing here. And then we have this one. This is a newer change than nothing, so we'll add the, and so on and so forth. The problem is if I had edited the first line and then this person had also edited the first line, my change would get pushed, and then when this person tried to, well, they would have to pull it first, but when they eventually wanted to add this change, would get a merge conflict, because it said, this isn't the old thing, this is something new, but yours is also something new, so I don't know which one to take, so tell me which one to take. Yeah, I mean, my line by line thing was probably not. So it's a little more intuitive than that. Like, if I come in between 2 lines and I just hit enter a bunch of times, it still knows that this content is here and not in that white space. So just don't be working on the same, say, function. But yeah, sit down with a group, work through some of these things in a few like dry runs, get your GitHub project set up. Decide who's going to have the main one, clone it, pull, do just like a couple checks on this workflow. And if there's any confusion, it's very good to address it early on with the team, so that you have a nice, clean Git repository. Don't code on master. You'll just run into a lot of mistakes. We just follow every time you want to do something new, you're making a branch. The only time master is used is to merge a complete finished feature back into your main code source. Finally, now that you have your ERDs, your your user stories, your ERDs, your routes, and your wireframes and story, you're going to set up your scaffolding for your project. And this is just the base files for like the roughest skeleton that you can make for your project. It's very helpful to do this stage as a pair, or you guys have 3 people groups that are a bit bigger, so as like a trio, sit together on one computer and create the new folder, do git init, do npm init, decide, well, you guys are using Node and Express, so create your initial server file, server.js or index.js, however you want to name it. Maybe do that initial stub of creating the Express server. Make sure that for the initial scaffolding, you have the basic Node modules that you'll want for your project. So npm install Express, npm install body parser, just the basics. And get the skeleton of the project, front end back end, and maybe some front end set up, and then add it to your GitHub repository. And then you'll have the full skeleton. Everyone will clone it. Everyone will pull it, and you'll all start. Make sure you're all starting on the same point before you go further. Don't have oh, I got the project all set up and it's working well on my computer. I'm just going to start plowing ahead, and someone in your group has not got all of this set up. Make sure you guys are all at the same point before you continue. Download install all the resources. These are npm stuff. Initially, just use CDN links whenever possible. So CDN's a content distribution network. So if you're using Bootstrap, use the link and include that in your HTML page. Don't download the whole Bootstrap source code and put it in your project, at least to start off with. I'd make it lightweight. So set up the scaffolding, clone it all so it's all on each of your computers, and finally just make sure the app loads on each of your environments to make sure that you set up everything correctly. Just get maybe a basic hello world page showing up, and at that point you can kind of get the green light from all of your members and kind of step forward into actual development. Well, actually, more important step before coding is to decide on team responsibilities. Up till this point, everything that we've looked over in planning should have been a joint effort in terms of team responsibilities. You don't really want to get into a situation where you're okay, Jackson, you do wireframes, I'll do ERDs, the other person, you're going to do scaffolding. Try and do everything together as a collective, because this is the foundational work that everyone needs to understand what your application will look like. And to also make sure that everyone's on board and comfortable with the direction that you're heading. It can be very what do you call it? It can be, it's not inclusive to do this work without one of your members or anything like that. Of course, going forward though, you will need to have a division of labor. You can't do the whole project pair or trio programming. You just wouldn't get very far. So you're going to need to divide your task according to, and this is where you have some options. You could divide it by front end, back end. Some people are working on the front end, some people are working on the back end. You could divide it based on the different things that your back end, which will most likely be an API, in that it serves JSON content to the front end. Divide work based on the different functions that does. You could divide work based on what you'll be developing in. So if someone really just wants to work on JavaScript, they work on JavaScript. Someone really likes HTML and CSS. That ends up being a front-end, back-end split. But in other tech stacks, it might be different based on the languages that you're using. Maybe someone works on the database. These are all options. The one I would really stress that you guys go towards is by breaking up your task based on features. And the feature will be linked to a user story. So a user does this. One person tackles that user story. Another person tackles another user story, and so on and so forth. The reason this is an attractive way of dividing tasks is because you guys are very early on in your web development careers. You don't want to be pigeonholed as a front end or back end developer too early on. Make sure that you're getting exposure to all aspects of the application. You want some front-end experience, you want some back-end experience. If at this moment you have some feelings stirring inside you where you're I'm a front-end developer, or I'm a back-end developer, that's where I would extra stress. If you feel that you're more of a front-end developer, this is a good opportunity to get experience in the back-end. like purposely look out and do some development in the areas that you're not comfortable with. Down the line and as your career progresses, you might end up being a specialist in front end or back end, and that's completely fine. I just think that like at this point, you're really going to have a lot of benefit from getting exposure to the full stack of this application. It's also very beneficial for when you come up here and you present your project, or later on when you're showing your project to potential employees, that you can speak to the whole project. If you only work on the front end, it's very hard for you to talk about the project in its whole and say like, this project aims to do these things, this is how we accomplished this particular feature. You'll probably just know like, well, the UI looks good because I did these things. It's much better to be able to know front to back what was happening. And with a feature-based division of labor, you'll have a better idea of the front to the back end and why stuff was done. So this is a nice one to divide it by. It's not the only one that you can do. If you really want to try another division of tasks, go for it. But just don't restrict yourself to one type of development just yet. Ready to code. Pow, pow, pow. So yeah, at this point, you would be ready to code. I don't expect you guys to get here today. Maybe like late tomorrow you might get here. Take the appropriate amount of time to do the planning. So don't rush through planning. I just want to code right away. Take the time, make sure all of this stuff makes sense. People often don't get mentor help during the planning stage. They just like go through it. Throughout the whole planning stage, if you want someone to look at like a wireframe, or if you want someone to look at your ERDs, take some opportunity. Also try and get like maybe a range of opinions. If you just get one mentor to look at your ERD and he says like, do this, do this, do this, ask someone else, see if they have other opinions. You're really starting to get into the point of development where there's very rarely one right way of doing something. There's often like a bunch of bad ways of doing something, but there are many useful patterns and like correct ways to build an application like you're going to be building over the next week. So try and shop around, see what patterns you like, see what advice makes sense to you, and yeah, don't get too caught up in doing it a single way. Just some tips for the scaffolding part of things. You're going to want to start with like static pages first. So the problem that you can get into when you're building a bigger application is to think, okay, this feature stems all the way from like this route. It delivers content to my front end page. My front end page then has to show it like this, and I have to be able to click on this thing. And then you just like code and code and code and code and code until you have that full feature done, and then you start testing. You're like, does it work? And 100% of the time it doesn't work, because there's no way you can write that much code and just have it go right off the bat. So you have a bunch of code that you wrote and it's not working, and then you have to start debugging it. And you start like in the back end, and then you check in the front end, and there's just so many areas that you can look between that it's a really hard way of developing. So instead, you want to divide each of these functions into kind of like static implementations. So the front end, can you just make the UI that will show the data that you need? Don't get real data, just use hard-coded data and see if that looks right, and see if you can interact with it in the right way. This will help you decide on things like class and ID nomenclature. You're using placeholders where you can. If they're just text, you can use like ipsum. And have you guys had exposure to these things? They're just like random text generators. So Phil Murray is a funny one. It's just random Bill Murray image generation, so you can give it a size. and you'll get a picture according to that. No. And then the other one that you had some like lorem ipsums, like centuries. It's like super, dates back to just like print generation. So it's like dummy text. Like the first lorem ipsum, I think, was this. It's no language. It just represents well what text looks like. So fill your content with things like that. And make sure it makes sense just on a static perspective. In the same way, on your back end, create up all of your routes and just use data objects. Data objects is like the pattern you saw with Tiny App. You didn't have a real database. You just had an object that stored all of your URLs, an object for the users. Get it working on that standpoint before you start integrating it heavily with the database so that you have component-wise kind of testing. Make sure it works independent of your front end or your database. And it says make sure it works in REPL, so like with curl tools. The other tool that I think I showed you guys earlier this week that is super handy is like Postman. So build out your back-end routes, and then before you have a front end, or not necessarily before you have a front end, but before your front end is finished and able to test those routes, just come on here and try the different routes that you have and make sure that they're getting the correct information. With Postman, it's cool. You can also save a bunch of requests. So if you have 10 requests in your application, you can save them with the correct URL, with the correct data that you're supposed to be sending there. So you can come back regularly and just like run off a bunch of requests, and allows for faster testing. Lastly, the group dynamics can be also one of the biggest challenges for any type of project. And because of that, it just has to be something that's on your mind. You have to be thinking about the mental health and wellness of your partners. Make sure everyone feels like they know what they're doing and they're well supported. Part of this will be communication. There are many communication tools. You just need to decide on a standard. So if you want to make your own Slack channel so you can communicate to one another, if you want to use like Telegram or WhatsApp or any of these tools, just make sure there's a clear set of protocol before you begin too far into your project on how you can communicate with each other, on where you're going to store information about the project. You have like these user stories and like wireframes and all of these resources that you've made in planning. Is there a nice central location that everyone has access to that stuff? Maybe you have a Google Drive, shared folder, different things like that. You could use like Trello if you want a nice information board just to throw stuff up and keep track of tasks and things that you're working on. You could use Trello to divide up features if you wanted to and assign them to different people. This starts sliding towards a more like project management approach, not just a communication solution. So you can also get interested in project management for this week. If you're thinking about how do we organize our structure, what does the life cycle of our project look like? You can look up project life cycle models and see which one maybe you can draw some things from. Like Scrum is a really popular one that you can look into. This project probably doesn't need a super in-depth level of like life cycle and project management things, but again, it's an opportunity to learn things. So if that's something you're interested in, you can do some research of that and try and bring some of that to your project. That's all the slides. Any questions on anything we went over up to this point or the project in general? You can do it. No, you guys will do well. And again, don't be too nervous. Like, it should be an exciting thing. And yeah, think about what aspects of the project would be interesting to you, and you'll do good. Yeah. And three people per group. That's also pretty cool. You might want to think about kind of stretching the project requirements to like make sure you guys will all have enough work. A lot of teams do these projects with just 2 people. So with 3 people, I think you have some opportunity to be more creative and add some bonus features or kind of push the boxes and lines of this project a bit more. Cool. Just out of curiosity, how comfortable do you guys feel with the like Git workflow that we briefly looked over? What's like, this is like kind of, this is like I am comfortable, this is like not comfortable at all. With the like the Git workflow we talked about with using a group. So like pulling, merging, working on a branch, pushing it back to master. So, okay. So as a group, that might be something you guys want to talk about, thinking like, how comfortable are we with this? How much should we like together look at what we need to do? Also, how many of you guys are interested in looking at that second pattern, which is doing a project with forks and with pull requests? So the difference, often the second one is used with bigger groups. It's also a more formal process. So with the first one, all of us share a single remote. Wow. So the first one, we have this pattern. So we all have this single remote origin, and we have our local ones. I guess in our case, there's 3 of us. And locally, what we're doing is we have the master branch, but we're mostly just making branches of new features and then adding them back to the main thing and then pushing them directly to this. This is like the working version or like the main version. And so each of us are doing that, making a new thing and adding it to this when it's finished. And then we have full control just to like, I think it's good, I'm going to push to master. And when there's something new here, each of us will have to like pull that so that our local masters are the same. That's the first pattern. The second pattern is we have one. I'm gonna erase this guy. We have one origin remote that we don't actually communicate with. Instead, we have like a forked version for each of us. And so we still locally like don't touch master. We work on our branches and are adding branches to our master. But then when we have an updated master, we push to our fork, and then we do like a pull request. And when there's a pull request, our main branch or our main remote gets notified. And then at this point, it's like a central hub to decide like, oh, I have like this list of pull requests. This one, this one, this one. I can go through and say, yep, this one should be added, and it gets added to the master. This one, not yet. This one, also added. And you get a little more, I guess, like verification around what goes into this one. It's also a pattern that like a lot of development teams use. So just from a exposure standpoint, it might be something useful to get exposure to. This one? So you can have just one of you own it. You could also GitHub supports like organization. So you could create an organization between the three of you, and then you all kind of like joint own it. Although someone would probably still own the organization. But that's not the main purpose. The main purpose is just like we have a formal handler for how we merge things into master. Whereas with the first pattern, we kind of can just loose form. Like I can just check with my group and be like, hey, I added in a new feature. It seems to be working. Can I merge it to master? And everyone just kind of gives me the thumbs up. I'm like, hey, I'm merging to master, and I just do it. Whereas this one, I can just be like, hey, everyone, I put a pull request to master. I think it's all good. If anyone wants to do a quick code review, and they can just view here, you can do like oh, these are the old changes, these are the new changes. Or sorry, this was the old file, this is the new file. And you just see what they changed, and you can just be like, yep, that looks good. Again, this might be an interest thing. If it's something you're interested in. This one takes a little bit more setup, but is not any harder in terms of day-to-day things and can protect you from stuff. But the other pattern is also fine as well. So looking at those two, how many people are interested in this second one or like learning more about it? Cool. What we might do then is later in the day I can see if I can get a room and we can just do like a small breakout on just like walking through how to do this. And then if you're interested, you can come. If you're not interested, that's fine. And yeah, so that's everything.